I always forget about the lighting here.
What's that?
I always forget about the lighting here.
Oh, yeah.
I come in and think, okay, somebody didn't turn the lights on. Oh, yeah, that's how it is.
Well, this is a lot brighter than it used to be.
I bet, yeah. Have these been replaced or something?
Yeah, I mean, relatively new from then, a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah, so we kind of have a little mixed bag, like that we're viewing our live stream and kind of watching our live content
Yeah.
view here, so
Yeah.
maybe wait a few more minutes.
Okay,
See if
certainly.
anyone else is going.
Yeah.
To introduce you and go from there, I guess.
I'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end. This normally wraps up by 7. Is that
Yeah.
right? So about 6:45, I'll try to be finished with my main
Perfect.
spiel.
And I'll kind of try and watch the YouTube and monitor it if any questions
Okay.
come through there and try to let you know. I'll be a little back and forth. We've got a little dinner starting at 7, so I'm just going to be setting up a couple things in there for that. But kind of, I have the TV on in there that has the stream going, so I can kind of follow you as well.
Okay. And like I said, for most of the questions I've left rather than at the end, if something comes up that's like really urgent to what I'm talking about,
Sure.
and especially if it's something that could be confusing if it's not brought up, then I'm okay.
Yeah.
In mid-course.
Perfect. And then if you remember, if not, I'll try to remember or remind you too. But if any of these guys or anybody here has a question, the audio doesn't pick up except for the mic. So if you remember, just repeat the question so those viewing online
Good point.
can hear it. Yeah. So.
We have a very similar system at St. Joseph. We don't use it for much besides mass, but it's hardwired into our sound system so that we had one day the mics weren't working in the beginning of mass, which meant everybody at home was just totally muted for them.
Yeah.
And the crazy part of it was once we got it working, that which was about the beginning of the penitential ride or something like that, the bishop's Casa CD started playing.
Oh man, that's funny.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, thank you guys for joining us tonight for RCIA, both here at St. Thomas as well as those that are watching on our live stream right now. Just want to welcome everyone back. I know it's been a crazy couple of weeks with all of the winter weather, and this is really the first time we've met as an RCIA class in about 3 weeks, with 2 weeks ago with the ice and the weather, and again last week, as well as last week being Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent. So just want to welcome everyone and hope for the students that are here and that are watching online that y'all were able to enjoy a couple days for your, I guess, spring break part 1. So anyways, it's great to have y'all here with us this evening. So tonight we're excited to announce we've got Father Jason Tyler with us here tonight, that he'll be speaking with us. The general topic for tonight is on life issues, and Father Jason is over at St. Joseph's in Fayetteville, and so we are very grateful to have him with us here tonight. And I'll be trying to monitor the Facebook and YouTube for those that are watching on the live stream. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in on Facebook in the comments or on YouTube in the comments, and we'll try and get those. I think Father's going to allow probably about 10 to 15 minutes or so of questions at the end if anyone has any questions. So anyways, again, welcome back, and grateful for y'all for being here, and let us welcome Father Jason Tyler. Thank you.
All right, Tess, do you hear me pretty well with this? Is this mic working? Okay, fantastic. And right. So a year into this, I'm still not fully used to speaking to a mostly empty room with the idea that most people are online. I do appreciate the few of you who are in person to help give me, some sense of a live audience too. But no, I do welcome those of you watching at home or wherever you are on your devices. Glad that you can join us, and glad for your interest in the topic tonight. And so the topic on life issues, on what does the Catholic Church teach, what does the Catholic Church believe about questions around human life. And often these questions end up being questions with the beginning of life, with the end of life, and then of course many points in between. But the beginning and the end tend to be where I get the most questions presented to me along the way, either from parishioners or sometimes even from priests in other parishes that know I've studied some of these topics. And so those of you who are here have kind of some bullet points, a few pages worth of what I'm going over tonight. And you feel free to look at those later on as well. So the first one that I'll start with is the issue of abortion. Now, this is the one that many of you may be most familiar with, the Catholic Church having a very clear and well-articulated position going back really since the beginning of the Catholic Church. Even in the late first century, there's a document called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, that speaks about the wrongness of taking a life in the womb. Obviously, they didn't have the techniques we had today, but the question of abortion is the largest and the most obvious issue because it involves the willful destruction of an innocent person by a private individual simply because that person is unwanted. And the existence of legal abortion has repercussions in many other areas, including in embryonic stem cell research, and even some of our end-of-life issues are issues in a certain sense because, as a society, we have devalued the unborn and those who are not yet sort of visible among us, as it were. As time moves on, the cause favoring human life is in many ways favored also by the technology that is developed. Years ago, there was a film called The Silent Scream that showed what it looked like for a child in the womb being aborted. And that video helped many to see, okay, we're not talking about just a clump of cells, we're talking about an actual human person. Well, nowadays, the imaging is so much better with ultrasounds, with different ways of seeing what's really going on in the womb. We have a great opportunity for people to look and see the real person that is there and to choose life rather than choosing what might be sort of convenient or helpful in the moment. Sometimes we think about abortion as a primarily political issue, but it's also a very personal issue. It has dimensions within the lives of everyone involved. And as much as we want to rightly influence public policy, we also have to be ready to do what's often far more influential in influencing the family or the person who's considering an abortion, to make sure that she has what she needs to be able to bring that child to term, to give that gift of life. Watch out for terminology when we speak about abortions, when we speak about the unborn in particular. We can speak of an unborn child. Certainly that's the most clear sort of way to speak about what it is that we're discussing. But it's certainly valid also to use terms like fetus and embryo and zygote. Those all have scientific determinations, within the particular development of, again, the unborn child, of the growing human person. But there's this term sometimes that pops up, pre-embryo. I don't know if anybody's ever heard the term pre-embryo, which is really just an embryo that's at a certain development stage. It's before it has implanted into the womb of the mother, because conception takes place in the fallopian tube, and then the newly conceived child has to move from the fallopian tube into the uterus. And sometimes you hear this term pre-embryo thrown around by those who want to favor the idea of destroying that embryo before it gets to the uterus and calling it simply an act of say, contraception rather than abortion. But the reality is the embryo is still the embryo, whether it's in the tube or it's moved into the uterus. It's the same group of chromosomes, the same developing human person. And I say group of chromosomes in a sense to remind us that the 46 chromosomes that each of us has, those are present already from conception. And so all the building blocks of life, all of the ingredients that are there to make the full-blown human person are there very early on. And so it's really a question of development more than anything else. And we should remember when we speak about abortion, obviously the compassion to those who are feel like they're in such a desperate circumstance that they might consider it. But we also need to remember the sacredness, obviously, the child is developing, and remember that it's not simply a religious issue. It's not something that we believe simply because we're Catholic, which is what we would say maybe about the Holy Trinity or about the transubstantiation, the idea of the bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ. When we speak about the sacredness of human life and life in the mother's womb even, that is something that we can arrive at by natural reason. When I say that we don't need religion necessarily to tell us that it's wrong to murder someone that's walking around and a child, an adult, whatever. And when we just consider what we're talking about and really think about what's happening there, we don't need a religious position necessarily to tell us that abortion is wrong, but our faith does move us to care more deeply. Hopefully our faith is what pushes us to say, okay, this is why I'm going to get involved and concerned about this. So the next life issue I want to touch on here, again, looking at the beginning stages of life in particular, the next thing I want to touch on is assisted fertility. And this is one where, those of you either here or those of you watching may have known someone along the way who may have known a couple that good, faithful couple gets married, gets into their marriage a few years, and they haven't had a child, and they go to the doctor to try to figure out what's wrong. Why are they not able to conceive a child? And it's a very holy desire, a very good desire to have a child, to bring forth that child into the world, to share, the love of husband and wife in such a way that love goes beyond the two of them and manifests itself in the physical person of another child. That's a wonderful and good desire that is there. And there are a lot of methods now that will help people to conceive who 20 years ago might not have been able to, or certainly 40 and 50 and 60 years ago would not have been able to. But it's important to remember that not everything that's technically possible, not everything that can be done because of our great technology is necessarily the right thing to do. When we speak about questions of assisted fertility, the main idea that the Catholic Church sort of wants to put forward is that it must harmonize with the idea of the unitive and procreative aspects remaining together. That the unitive and the procreative elements of the marital sexual act are meant to stay together and not to be separated. During the course of this year, have you had a topic or an evening on contraception and the church's teaching on that? Has that come up as one of your topics? Maybe, okay. So, just in general, very briefly, part of the reason that the church teaches that contraception is wrong is the idea that the marital act has a unitive element, uniting the spouses, husband and wife, and has a procreative element, that is to say, an openness to the bringing forth of human life. Not that every act has to be intending that, but that openness has to be there. And procreative means to create along with God, really, is what we're talking about. And so most of the time, when you hear maybe some Catholic speaker or some comment speak about separating the procreative and unitive aspects of the marital act, they're often talking about a contraceptive act, right? That is trying to have the unitive without having the procreative. Well, with questions of assisted fertility, the danger we have to avoid is the idea of potentially seeking the procreative without the unitive. And so what the church asks is saying that every child that is conceived and brought forth into this world should be brought forth from the loving embrace of mother and father, by their loving self-gift, which is not just an idea of the mind, but is actually the physical act of sexual intercourse, is the proper way for a child to come into the world, because again, that child is a manifestation and existence, a bringing forth of the love of husband and wife, of mother and father into the world. So, in general, if a particular method of assisted fertility or assisted reproduction, you might hear sometimes, if a particular method assists the natural process of conception, then it's okay and it's a very good thing. But if it replaces the natural process, if it does something that circumvents, goes around the use of sexual intercourse as the way that child is conceived, that's an area where the church would say, okay, no, that's where we don't agree with that. We don't believe in that. Because part of, again, that dignity of the child to be born, to come into the world, is in part from that loving embrace of mother and father, of husband and wife. Now, certainly, one thing to remember is that we know, from time immemorial, many people are conceived in ways that do not fully fit that description, right? Someone who's conceived by a couple that's not married. Someone, even more tragically conceived through an act of rape. In those cases, the person conceived is still and completely a fully human person with all the same dignity that you and I have. And so also, a child conceived and brought forth into life through an act of assisted reproduction that replaces the marital act, one that we would say is morally illicit or morally wrong, is still and completely a fully human person with all the same rights and dignity that go with that. So that's important to remember along the way. But again, the basic idea, assisted reproduction, assisted fertility, needs to assist the marital act and not replace it. Therefore, the Catholic Church does not accept in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, or surrogate motherhood. And often, if I mention this, if we had a larger room here present, there'd probably be somebody that would say, wow, I didn't know that. It's not something that comes up in many homilies, right? I've been a priest 15 years, and I can't think of any reading that exactly matches this. I've worked it in once or twice on something, but it doesn't lend itself right away to it. And again, part of that, the building blocks, if you will, is the idea of that sexual act having the unitive and procreative aspects that need to remain united. And so procreation then needing to come from that loving physical embrace of mother and father, of husband and wife. One of the difficulties in vitro fertilization has created is what are sometimes called surplus embryos. And this is an additional problem with in vitro fertilization. Even if you get past the process itself and the idea of replacing the marital act, another big issue is surplus embryos. In vitro fertilization is expensive. You take the egg from the woman's body, you get the man to produce sperm and combine them in a dish, and then implant that embryo into the mother. It's an expensive process. And part of the expense, yes, is the implantation, but a lot of it is also just extracting the egg, or combining the egg and the sperm and everything. And so because of the expense, a lot of times fertility clinics will create surplus embryos. A couple comes in, they're looking for one child, and the other part of it is that the implantation process is often not successful on the first try. And so what they do is a couple wants one child. Well, the clinic might create 5 or 6 embryos with the idea that at least one of them then would be successful. They try one, then they try another, etc. The other thing that can happen is that a couple might want more than one child, but they don't want them all at once, so they create the several embryos, and the couple wants to have, their one child now, another one 2 or 3 years later, maybe even a third one, but usually, just a couple of them in there. And so let's say they create 6 embryos, and the first one fails, so there's a life that's been created and then destroyed. Maybe the second one implants successfully and is brought to term. So now you've got 4 extra embryos that are left from this procedure. So what happens with them? Well, some couples, as I mentioned, will want another child later. They'll have that frozen embryo implanted, some years later. Some embryos get destroyed for research purposes. They get destroyed so that scientists can look at and study various parts of human life and make that, in their search for a cure for something. And then some just remain in a suspended state. I don't know the number now. At one time, it was hundreds of thousands of embryos that were estimated to be kept in a deep freeze in different clinics. And this is one of the absurd and horrible difficulties that this process has brought, because you have these real human persons that kind of have no future, right? They're sitting there suspended in the deep freeze. So what do we do with these leftover embryos, these surplus embryos? And this is a question here, what to do with these embryos. It's a question that shows how new technology and new topics often develop faster than the ethical research or the ethical analysis can catch up with. Because we've known this is a problem for 20 or 30 years probably, but yet, again, we don't have a fantastic solution here. There are a few things, and those of you who have the notes see that I wrote here: embryo adoption or embryo rescue or heterologous embryonic transfer. All of those are different names for describing a process where someone who is not the mother or father of the child that was conceived for purposes of in vitro fertilization, someone who's not the mother or father says, hey, I know we've got all these extra embryos out there. I want to adopt one. A woman says she might want to adopt one, have it implanted into me, and I will bring it to term. And they call that embryo adoption if she plans to keep the child, or embryo rescue if she plans to bring it to term and then give it up for adoption. And there's some questions, again, among, what is the Catholic approach on this? And it's actually something of a disputed topic. faithful Catholic bioethicists will agree that these embryos were created in a morally evil act. Now, evil here doesn't mean like some serial killer, chainsaw massacre kind of situation or something absolutely horrible. Evil in the language of Catholic moral reasoning means something that's wrong, that's not good. And so, in that sense, we say these embryos were created through an evil act. Great intentions, no doubt, but an evil act of itself. But the embryos themselves are innocent of what their parents did, and they are, in fact, very much living human beings, even if, at the 8-cell stage or the single-cell stage or wherever they are in that very early point of development. So the question is, again, can we implant them into willing mothers or willing hosts, if you will? Those who favor it say that implanting and bringing them to term is the only way to save them. The importance of saving a human life means that a woman who adopts an embryo is doing a very heroic act in this way. But the contra-arguments, the arguments against, if you will, would say that a woman who adopts a child in this way is becoming pregnant without her husband's help. And in that way, she's sort of breaking the marriage bond in a certain sense. They say that the act of implantation itself is intrinsically evil, that's wrong of itself, and that just much like creating the human life in the lab would be. And they would say that implanting the embryo in some way sanctions the in vitro fertilization by which it was created. Now, this is the thing. Again, it's been around a while, but the Catholic Church has not taken a definitive position on this question of embryo adoption or transferring the embryo to a different woman who's willing to bring the child to term. The sort of leaning, if you will, has been against it. The last time it was brought up in a really official document, I think, goes back to about 2008. When the Vatican was speaking on other topics similar to this, and it brings up this idea. It acknowledges that some have proposed it, and it simply said, we would note that this solution has many problems of its own also. So they sort of punted. They said, we're not ready to speak definitively on that. But they've said this is something we're not, we see many problems here, basically. Sort of setting things up for the possibility of speaking more definitively in the future. All right, so again, assisted fertility. One option is always natural family planning. If you have the handout and you see the letters NFP, that's what that stands for. Natural family planning we often think of as a way to avoid pregnancy, and it's simply about determining when a woman is likely to conceive a child. And most of the time, if a couple wants to avoid pregnancy, they avoid sexual intercourse during those likely fertile days. But it can also be used the other way. It can be used to achieve pregnancy. If a couple finds out when a woman is ovulating, when she is most likely to conceive, they can have sexual intercourse at that time. And that's, again, a very good technique. Another technique that can be used here are medical techniques that it could be a surgery, for example. That, let's say there's a blockage in the fallopian tube or something like that, and maybe a surgery can clear that up. And surgeries in that sense would be evaluated much like any other surgery. So what's the benefit, what's the burden, what's the risk involved, what's the hoped for outcome, with restoring fertility being seen as a positive outcome of itself. The question comes up sometimes of fertility drugs, and I get phone calls from time to time about this. And again, in principle, we have no problem with the idea of most of the fertility drugs, because what they do is they usually stimulate the ovaries to release more eggs. Now, I said in principle, no problem. The person who's considering this procedure needs to speak to her doctor and ask what are the chances of bringing multiple pregnancies, twins, triplets, or beyond. And if it's likely she's going to conceive so many children that she cannot bring them to term, well, that's a problem too, because then you're creating a life that will be possibly destroyed naturally in the womb, and we would never favor sort of this idea of selective abortion, of saying, okay, you've got 4 growing children there, you're not going to make it to all 4, we need to kill one of them so that the other 3 survive. We would not favor that either. And so that's where it's important on the front end. Now, again, I said I've had phone calls, people ask me about this, and that question the thing I always caution is to ask, what are your chances of conceiving twins or triplets? And thankfully, that discussion has usually happened before the conversation happens with me, and usually the woman who tells me this will give me a percentage that the doctor said it's maybe a 5% chance or maybe a 3% chance or what. I'm not going to know those numbers right offhand, but that's the sort of thing to ask. And again, the thing I always throw back is that, okay, even though it's a small percentage, are you prepared physically, emotionally, spiritually to have twins or triplets or whatever could happen there? So. All right, next topic here is embryonic stem cell research. Now, this is a topic that probably got a lot more attention maybe 20 years ago even than it does right now. I remember it was a very big thing at the beginning of the presidency of George W. Bush because it was a question of whether there would be federal funding for this particular type of research. So what that involves, embryonic stem cell research would involve taking a human embryo, often one of these surpluses from in vitro fertilization, intentionally destroying the embryo's life, destroying the embryo, and basically being able to create a cell line, being able to sort of copy cells from this embryo. And the question arose at some point of saying, okay, should the government fund this research? Because there were so many promises, people said, from embryonic stem cell research. But the funding that would be involved to get there was more than what the private companies were willing to take that kind of gamble on. So the thought was whether the government should fund it. And the church was against government funding there for the simple idea that it would encourage more embryos to be destroyed in this way, that it would create more of that kind of destruction. Ultimately, I think what President Bush did was he said something like, we'll fund embryos that were, the cell lines that were created before a certain date, but not after this date or whatever, so that some of that incentive would be taken out. In many ways, not a perfect solution, but that's what happened at the time. But be clear, it was never a question about whether it was illegal. The scientists were not going to be taken to jail for doing it. It was just a question of whether your tax dollars and mine were going to fund it. We're going to be part of continuing that to happen. Sometimes you'll hear people say the church opposes stem cell research. That's an incomplete and thus inaccurate statement. We do not oppose stem cell research from what are called adult stem cells, which means stem cells taken from the umbilical cord, from the placenta after birth, from certain blood cells and such along the way. It was the question of the embryonic stem cell research. Bone marrow, that was another great source of stem cells. And so I've known people who had, I'm blanking, I want to say Parkinson's disease, who had some treatment from some stem cells, and it was from bone marrow-derived stem cells. And I said, fantastic, that's wonderful, glad you got that. Again, it's the embryonic stem cells, the ones that destroy a human embryo. Thankfully, what's happened along the way, as much as this was a big controversy in the early 2000s, around November 2007, there was a breakthrough, so to speak, that allowed us to reprogram adult stem cells, again, those from blood or from bone marrow or whatever, to make them pluripotent, to make them malleable, so to speak, to do different things. Because that was always the promise with the embryonic cells, was that they were so malleable you could form them into anything. And at one time, blood cells could only become blood cells, brain cells could only become brain cells, etc. But I bring all this up, even though it's not as much of a hot topic today, it is another part of that reasoning process, that thought process, if you will. Because this, if you have the sheet, that bottom of page 2 there, I said, if an embryo will be destroyed anyway, why can't we just use it for research? Why can't we get some good out of it? Well, we would never want to kill one person, even if that person is going to die soon anyway. If I choose to kill that person, it's a difference between the person possibly dying on his or her own versus me being the agent of that person's death. And if I become the agent of one person's death, even in the small embryo that's smaller than the period at the end of a sentence, if I become an agent in that person's death, will I be more easily able to become the agent in other people's deaths? Will I change myself into the kind of person that's more able to take a life? Even beyond just, again, the initial embryo question. Because every one of our actions forms our character, right? Everything that we do affects what we're going to do in the future. That's where, right now we're in Lent, and sometimes people find they give up a certain thing for Lent, or they take on a new practice, and Easter comes along, and they're like, you know what, I've really gained a lot from praying the rosary every day. I'm going to keep on doing that. Or I don't really need that, hour of Netflix or 2 hours of Netflix or whatever I was watching before Lent. I can continue to go without it. I have now formed myself into the kind of person who can go without that. So our actions, again, they form our character. They form what we're likely to do or not do in the future. And so we don't want to start killing embryos in order to benefit from them, because soon after that, we start killing others killing one to sort of save another along the way. All right, I wrote cloning is my next point here, questions about cloning, and this is always one that we love to think about sometimes in terms of science fiction-y type stuff, right? The idea of creating another person, of creating a copy of ourselves along the way. And often you hear, and again, this is where terminology becomes important. You'll hear sometimes these distinctions that are made between therapeutic cloning on the one hand and reproductive cloning on the other. And often these distinctions are made in the context of trying to justify therapeutic cloning, but not reproductive cloning. Now understand here, both therapeutic and reproductive cloning begin with the same process. They both begin by taking, say if someone wanted to clone me, they're taking some of my cells, or maybe a cell even, and then taking a woman's egg cell, removing the nucleus from that egg cell and replacing it with that cell they've taken from my body, and then using a little electrical shock to make that cell start dividing and doing the process that a normal human embryo begins to do in its division. All of what I just described is identical whether you're talking reproductive cloning or therapeutic cloning. In the case of reproductive cloning, the newly formed cell that has begun to divide and it becomes a genetic copy of me, it's allowed to grow to term. It's maybe implanted into a woman's body so that it's brought to term. And 9 months later, you don't have a 41-year-old man with a beard, you have a baby. So, cloning is not about creating a copy of where you are here and now in life. It's about creating ultimately a child that would have your exact genetic composition. And society, for the most part, has come down pretty strongly against reproductive cloning. I think all of our society has been able to say, yeah, we don't want that. We don't want genetic copies of people running around, people trying to sort of make themselves, a certain sense, immortal in that way. Part of it is, I think we as a society understand well some of the potentials also for genetic manipulation of trying to make the sort of augmented human beings along the way and such. But the Catholic position is we don't like either form of cloning because both of them involve creating a new human person. Even in the case of therapeutic cloning, you've created that new human person, but instead of allowing that new person to grow up and become a child and an adult and whatever, what you've done instead is you've created the cell. Maybe you're going to let it get to the blastocyst level at 8 cells or something like that, and then you're going to kill it You're going to destroy it in order to get some stem cells, to create some new therapy, to perhaps try to cure the parent, the person you pulled the original cell from. The big problem with therapeutic cloning is not only is it creating a human life that in no way connects to the marital sexual act, that's the proper way of life being created, but it's also creating a life in order to destroy it, in order to use it for someone else. And human life is never meant to be used. It's never meant to be taken in that way, but instead human life is always meant to be cherished, to be loved for its own sake. So yeah, the cloning bans that you hear sometimes, you have to be careful and notice that it's often not banning the therapeutic cloning, it's often banning only the reproductive. All right, end-of-life issues, sometimes brought up in the sense of when to pull the plug, and this is one that I probably get more questions about than anything else. So some things to remember here. First of all, life is sacred all throughout our lives. It doesn't become less sacred when we become of a certain age, when we become of a certain level of illness, a lack of productivity, or lack of being able to move around and enjoy things, whatever it is, human life continues to be precious, continues to be sacred. And so we have to follow that. And at the same time, we have to understand also that we are not obligated as human beings to use each and every measure to prolong our life as long as possible. There does reach a point when we can say, okay, we've done what we can, we're going to step back and let nature take its course. So before I get into those distinctions, I just want to define here euthanasia, defined as an action or omission which of itself or by intention causes death, in order that all suffering may in this way be eliminated. And that's sometimes distinguished between active euthanasia and passive. Active euthanasia is currently legal in some states. So you can give someone a deadly pill in certain states. Oregon was the first one. For a long time it was the only one, but now a few more, and I don't remember all of them. And often you'll hear also physician-assisted suicide, and there's a slight distinction between the two. Physician-assisted suicide means the doctor is giving you a pill or something that you take yourself to end your life. Euthanasia involves someone else perhaps putting that pill in your mouth, or perhaps putting a mask on your face, or whatever. Someone else reaches in and is physically involved in taking your life. Physician-assisted suicide means they've prescribed you a lethal drug that you take maybe at home or whatever. And again, both are wrong. And again, Arkansas, thankfully, is not one of the states that allows direct euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. But this question comes up sometimes about passive euthanasia. What is passive euthanasia? Allowing someone to die, basically, in order to eliminate that person's suffering. And we have to be careful here again on terminology, because sometimes people would say that, okay, if I've decided not to receive every possible treatment to prolong my life as long as possible, that's an act of euthanasia. Well, no, or more accurately, if I'm making this decision on behalf of a loved one, say a parent, a grandparent, whoever I might be charged with making the decision for. Passive euthanasia would be withholding something that we know keeps the person alive, and something that is not overly burdensome or difficult on the person. Something that, if you were to, remember that negative 20-degree weather we had last week, right? If you put somebody out, someone who's not able to walk, if you put them outside in that weather, they're going to die, right? That would be sort of a passive euthanasia. But no, thankfully, even the euthanasia advocates would not do that. They know there's a lot of suffering involved in in freezing to death, and so they're not going to push for that. But that's a sort of hypothetical type example of a passive trying to make someone die, to just remove what they need in order to live. Now, back to the distinctions I was talking about a moment ago, the idea that we're not obligated to do absolutely everything possible, but at the same time, there are certain things we need to do in end-of-life care. One, we make a distinction between what's called ordinary care, or often sometimes called proportionate care. The terms are often interchangeable, versus extraordinary or disproportionate care. Ordinary care or ordinary means of preserving life have to be used. Extraordinary means or disproportionate means may be withheld at the choice of the patient or the patient's surrogate, the person who's making those decisions. A treatment is considered ordinary or proportionate if it has a reasonable hope of benefit, if it does not impose excessive burden on the patient, and does not impose excessive expense on the family or the community. A treatment is extraordinary or disproportionate if it does not offer reasonable hope of benefit, or if it entails excessive burden, or if it imposes excessive expense on the family or the community. Clearly, most cases do fall to individual judgment, and given the advancing technology that's part of our life, the differences in each situation. What's disproportionate for one person now may be proportionate for a different person later on. Secular bioethics will, in this point, speak a lot about the question of benefits versus burdens, and it's not a bad framework to use overall. We can recognize a similar framework of benefits versus burdens of a proposed treatment or a proposed medical intervention, a proposed drug, whatever it may be. One of the big differences, perhaps the biggest difference, is that as Catholics, we're going to say a benefit is always to be seen in the person's life continuing. That the person himself or the person herself is always a benefit and never a burden. What might be a burden in a given moment is a particular treatment. So if, for example, it's a question of a feeding tube, but you're going to have to restrain the person because the person has dementia and is going to pull the tube out. Well, you might forego the feeding tube, not because you want that person to die, but because you don't want to go through the burden of the restraints and the physical limitations that you're having to impose in order to give the food and water in that case. And so, again, the benefits, burdens, as long as we understand the person himself or herself to be a benefit, that we can never say this person is a burden, so we're going to end his life or her life, or we're going to allow things to happen because that person has no quality of life. On the other hand, again, it's about the particular treatment or the intervention. What does that do to the process? How burdensome is that on the person? How beneficial is it on the person? In the U.S. Catholic Bishops' document on the ethical and religious directives, it speaks about food and water being presumed to be ordinary treatment, that is normally to be considered ordinary care and not extraordinary, not to be considered normally a medical act. However, there are even exceptions there. Pope John Paul II spoke about ordinary and proportionate care, food and water being ordinary and proportionate care in patients in the vegetative state. You might remember the big Terry Schiavo case back in 2005, that even when we give food and water by artificial means, it's still part of the basic necessities of life and not primarily to be seen as a medical intervention. But again, if the delivery itself, if the tube itself is causing the problem, then it can be removed or it can be withheld, not because the person has become a burden, not because the person's life is not worth living, but because the benefit of the life being given through that tube, the benefit is outweighed by the heavy burden involved in the process. And so a similar thing comes into play even, say, with pain medication, when there's a question of potential pain medication that could shorten someone's life, and that's not what you intend, but it's a possibility. That can be accepted there as well. Finally, I know we're 10 minutes till time, and I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I do want to touch on sort of the big issue of our day right now, the question of vaccines and the COVID vaccine, right? You may have heard something about this along the way, some of the questions about the ethical, moral situation with it, especially as it relates to the question of abortion. The vaccines that are currently available right now for us in the United States are the one from Pfizer and the one from Moderna. And there are others, say in the process along the way. But those are the main two that you're hearing about right now. Both of them, unfortunately, when they were testing their vaccines, they used some tissue that was developed from a cell line derived from an abortion in about 1972, I think. So the question is, can we take those vaccines? The Vatican has said, yes, you can take it. The U.S. Bishops' Conference has said, yes, you can take it. Multiple individual bishops, including our own Bishop Taylor in Little Rock, has said, yes, you can take it. Why? Why is that different than, say, the embryonic stem cell research thing that I was talking about earlier? A few things. One, this is not a situation where you have aborted cells that are within the vaccine. It's also not a situation where a child was killed intentionally in order to create some cure, to create research or whatever. This was sadly a situation where someone decided to have an abortion. And then someone says, hey, let's benefit from that. Let's get some cells out and research, et cetera, et cetera. In a certain sense, it's similar to a murder victim whose body has been donated to science. Right? A murder victim, someone who was killed unjustly, wrongly, horribly. Can that body be donated to science? We would say yes, it can be, assuming the person put that in his or her will or made that known, or family members consented for that. We have the proper sort of things in place there for that. Part of the difference with abortion is the child had no opportunity to offer that sort of consent, no chance to say, I want my body to be used for scientific research. But another big part of it is the question of scandal. That hypothetical murder victim I talked about, whose body might be donated to science for research purposes. Everyone would acknowledge, yeah, that guy's death was wrong. That was horrible. And no one would think, oh, those scientists there who studying that cadaver, they must approve of murder because of what they did. No one would think that. However, because of abortion being a more disputed question, we have a greater calling to have some significant witness value on that issue. That's what scandal means in the theological sense, not just something that shocks us, but something that could cause another person to sin. And so the question of whether it's appropriate to take these vaccines really comes down to the question of, are we giving scandal in sort of giving some little level of goodness, so to speak, to that abortion that happened way back when, and potentially to other abortions that could happen in the future. Again, that's something of a concern. And if there were better alternatives, ethically better alternatives that did not have this same connection, then by gosh, yes, we would be saying, hey, I don't want the Pfizer, I don't want the Moderna, I want this other one that had no connection to an abortion whatsoever. We don't have that reality. We have either the question, take the vaccine or not. And we're dealing with a pandemic that is significant enough to say, yes, we need that. Another thing sometimes people criticize on that point is this is the church being opportunistic, this is Johnny-come-lately position that it's convenient because you guys don't like COVID and you want to get rid of it. That's not true either. This has been discussed in the context of the rubella vaccine in the past. The rubella vaccine has similar connections through its testing process, et cetera, to an abortion. And that same sort of analysis I just described has been published by the Holy See on a couple of different occasions to say that yes, we should be, as a society, we should be pushing back on these companies. We're sort of saying we need to receive, we're doing this under protest to receive this, but people need to be doing research that's more ethically sound. But when there are grave situations and the need to protect one's own health and the health of others, taking a vaccine that has that ethical taint can can be acceptable. Now, could it be acceptable? Someone said, could it be acceptable if it were a matter of, okay, we're going to kill one child and that's going to create a vaccine for 1 million people. Is that an acceptable thing? Well, no, that's not, because we could never take one life specifically in order to use that life to save others. So anyway, again, I've gone a little bit longer on the presentation part than I wanted, but I wanted to include all that. I have time for questions now, both among those of you gathered here in person as well as those of you watching on your devices that I think may have entered some questions on the chat. And somebody here able to present those to me? Deacon Paul, you were... Oh, okay. Yes.
So, you're talking about the pros and cons of embryo adoption.
Yes.
But when it comes to how it's implanting the embryo with sanction, fertilization,
Yeah.
is that different than what you're just talking about, how using the vaccine with sanction the research?
Yeah, great question. So the question is here, when I was speaking earlier about embryo adoption or heterologous embryonic transfer, and one of the arguments against it is to say that implanting an embryo that was developed in that way sanctions and gives some good grace, so to speak, to the act of creating that embryo in the first place. So the question is that an analogous position to the question with the vaccine right now? Does taking the vaccine at this moment give some moral sanction, some try to legitimacy, if you will, to that abortion that happened so long ago? And the answer is that's a very good analogy. And that's exactly the reason that this is an issue, right? That's exactly the reason that, that the question has arisen about the vaccines. And that's why, it's good that people think about this, right? It's good that they consider that. The difference is the question around the implantation of the embryo in the first case, right? So in the question of in vitro fertilization, and especially the question of whether implanting the child is itself a sort of a continuation of that act from before, and the question of whether the implantation is wrong in and of itself. No one believes, at least no one with any great credibility believes that taking a vaccine is wrong in and of itself. And I don't think anyone can really say that taking a vaccine somehow continues that abortion. There is a question, yes, of whether it gives some moral sanction, if you will, to that abortion. That if it tries to throw something good on something that cannot be. Yes?
But when you take the vaccine, aren't you not supporting, but saying it's okay to do research on embryos, even if they weren't supported for that purpose?
Yeah.
You're kind of giving your support behind that.
Yes, in a certain sense. So the question is saying, if you take the vaccine, aren't you in some way saying that it was okay to do that research, if you will, on the child? And again, that's part of the controversy that comes in there. I think one of the big distinctions to make is one, in recognizing the number of areas where this is probably kind of laced throughout our society and other medicines as well. So if we don't take this vaccine for that reason, there are a lot of other reasons, other things we're going to have to forego as well. Another point there is to say again that to try to make our opposition known in some other ways. And so the National Catholic Bioethics Center is one of the items I have on the sheet there. For those watching at home, ncbcenter.org. They actually have, I think, a model letter to write up that you could, a template, if you will, for a letter to write to the vaccine companies to let them know of your moral displeasure, if you will, with the whole situation. But you're right in saying that the arguments are somewhat similar, and it does have that danger, if you will, of what we would call a kind of passive cooperation with what happened. Yeah. Okay, Adam, do we have some questions from the, yes?
Well, just checking, Father, I think we're
or Deacon Paul? Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, so kind of the same
Uh-huh.
you're talking about this implementation issue. I'm
Mhm. Okay.
What happens to the embryos that are not implanted, and what's the ethical ramifications of that decision?
Yeah. So the question of the embryos that are not implanted, is that sort of a form of passive euthanasia? What happens with those embryos that never get implanted? What are the ethical implications? Those are some fantastic questions. Part of the reason why we oppose in vitro fertilization is the absurd and the absurdly difficult situation that results from it. This is something nobody's found a really fantastic solution for. Some have suggested that we need to figure out how long these frozen embryos are sort of still alive while they're frozen, right? How long are they alive in the freezer? And if we figure that out, then at the end of that life cycle, then we would be able to let them go from the freezer, so to speak. Let them, bury them, essentially, at that point. And so your question is that a form of passive euthanasia and simply allowing them to stay in the freezer, for decades potentially and never be implanted? Possibly. It certainly has, a lot of the same elements there, and part of the again, part of the reason not to create the extra embryos and everything, but it's passive euthanasia, I would argue, not on the part of the woman who was thinking about embryo adoption and decides not to. It's passive euthanasia potentially on the part of the person who set things up with IVF and with the technicians and everyone involved in that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I certainly agree with what you said.
Yeah.
Preventing that situation from ever.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, I guess that would be the same case for abortions, occurs in rape.
Yeah.
You would just hope that that wouldn't have occurred in the first place.
Right. Yeah. And again, but all the points you bring up are also part of why the church has not given a definitive statement on this whole question of embryo adoption, because we do recognize, gosh, there are human lives at stake here, and how do we, how do we respond to that reality? So, you're welcome. Yes, Deacon Paul.
I was just going to say that, especially for the young people that are here watching, that we've been discussing yes and no and gray areas of circumstances as a result of a lot of research and ideas. For us, for you, these questions should be asked before we start doing things.
Yeah.
It would be good to get into community and say, how far should we go with this before we do it? Just wanted to get that.
Yeah. Great observation there. Deacon Paul was just saying that, we ask about questions about these gray areas, these yes, no, can we do this, can we do that? And he's pointing out that those are the things that should be looked at before we get too far along the technical matter of things, before we get too deep into all of that. Part of my favorite novel of all time is called A Canticle for Leibowitz. And it was written in the late 1950s. And the premise is basically that humanity almost destroys itself in a nuclear war in the 20th century. And then the book starts like 700 years later with some monks out in the desert recopying old books and trying to hold on to the knowledge. Because after this nuclear war, people burn all their books and they get mad at science and they want to destroy everything. And these monks are then trying to preserve this little bit of knowledge in their monastery. And it follows, this particular monastery through a few different stages, various centuries. By the end of the book, they're back into really good technology again, probably better than what we have now. And the whole question about nuclear war is coming up again. And can they prevent it a second time? And the big thing that the book is really pointing to a lot of times is to say, hey, just because we can do certain things, that doesn't mean we should right away. That there are other considerations involved. And so, we as a society in 21st century should have wonderful respect for the hard sciences, so to speak, the biology, the physics, the chemistry, everything that's given us so many technologies and conveniences that we have. At the same time, we need the humanities. We need literature and philosophy and all the things that really make us human so that we can use well the sciences that have been given to us, right? Even with COVID right now, don't we? We see the need for that. We need the science. We need the treatments, the therapeutics, the vaccines, but we also need the human touch on how to apply these things, how to make it real. Even when we talk about lockdowns and quarantines and that sort of thing, science, again, the physical sciences, the life sciences tell us a lot, and then the social sciences, if you will, make it happen in people's lives. And as a society, we need both elements. We need the left and the right parts of our brain, so to speak, in making all that happen. Any last questions? All right, it's been a pleasure to talk to you all. I thank you all. Maybe wrap up with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord our God, you are the author of all life, and we thank you for the gift of life that we have, the gift of life of our friends and our family members around us. Give us your grace and your strength to be your people, always ready to do your will. Help us to understand and appreciate the sacredness of every life around us. Give us your strength and your blessing in all things. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good night. Thanks. I'm sorry? I have not read that.
You should read that.
Okay.
She was an African-American woman, again, with cervical cancer, and it was, so the first time they were successfully able to grow cells outside of the body, and for the first time. And so that's very much in terms of the...
I will look that up. A world like
Immortal life.
immortal life.